Welcome to Economic News, brought to you by Doug. Today we are going to take a deep dive into something pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a recent article from The Economist, written by Scott Bessent.
Bessent.
Now, you might remember him as an economic advisor to Donald Trump.
Right.
And just so you know, we here at Economic News, we don't speak for The Economist. We're just here to kind of break down his argument and look at what he's saying.
Explore the ideas.
Exactly. Explore the ideas.
Yeah.
And his big argument in this piece is that, well, we need to kind of rethink the whole international economic system.
Whoa. That's a big one. Completely redo it.
Well, not completely. He doesn't want to just throw it all away. He actually thinks that would be a huge mistake.
All right.
Economically, strategically.
Okay, so what's he saying then?
He's saying there are some serious issues, some flaws in the system and the benefits that maybe we used to get as the U.S. They're not so clear anymore. Yeah. So the main thing that you'll see running through the article is this tension between the economic benefits that we expect from global trade. We all want cheaper goods and services.
Sure.
But at the same time, how do we balance that with national security concerns? Because as the world gets more and more interconnected, new vulnerabilities pop up.
Yeah, that makes sense. The more reliant you are on others,
Exactly.
the more vulnerable you might become.
So we're going to kind of unpack all that. It gets pretty fascinating when you start to see how all these pieces are interconnected. Have you ever stopped to think about how, your own wallet, how your personal finances are really tied to things like international stability, political stability,
Right.
even the U.S.'s ability to defend itself?
Oh, for sure.
So this deep dive, this is Bessent's perspective on all of that and why things might need to change. So to kind of get us started, where do you even begin with something this big? Well, Bessent looks at the underlying assumptions about the global economy. Like, what did we base all of this on in the first place? And he points out that there were really two big theories behind globalization. But when you actually look at the results, it didn't quite work out the way people thought.
The theory versus reality, right? So what were these theories? What was the first one?
So the first theory that he lays out, the idea was, if we encourage economic cooperation through open markets, free trade, then that would actually strengthen U.S. national security.
Interesting. How so?
The thinking was, if countries are doing business with each other, if they depend on each other economically, then they're going to be less likely to, fight wars with each other.
Makes sense on the surface.
Yeah.
Less likely to bite the hand that feeds you, I guess.
Right. And there were some examples where it seemed to work. Like, think about post-World War II Europe and Japan.
Oh, right.
They were devastated, but they got back on their feet, partly because they had access to American markets, right? And they did become key security allies for the U.S., so there it seemed to pan out.
Yeah, sounds like a win-win. But I'm guessing there's a but here.
Oh, yeah, definitely a but. And the big but is that it didn't really work out that way when it came to integrating with certain countries.
Which ones?
Countries that, maybe weren't so aligned with U.S. interests. And he specifically points to China.
Right. China's been in the news a lot lately, especially in terms of trade.
Exactly. And the idea was, okay, we'll open up trade with China. It'll help them develop, and they'll become more democratic, more moderate. But what Bessent argues is that it actually seems to have empowered the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, wow. The opposite of what was intended, potentially.
Yeah.
So increased prosperity didn't really lead to greater political openness.
Not so much. And it gets even trickier because remember those global supply chains we talked about,
Right.
the ones that were built for maximum efficiency? Well, according to Bessent, they've actually given the CCP a pretty big geopolitical tool.
Oh, how so?
Think about it. They now have the ability to disrupt the flow of goods, essential goods, to other countries. And that gives them a ton of leverage in international relations. It's not just about getting cheaper stuff anymore.
Right.
It's about potential vulnerabilities in those supply chains. So those cheap goods, if they're suddenly cut off, that could be a huge problem.
Makes you think twice about where everything comes from. Okay, so that's the security side of things. But what about the pure economics? You said there was a second theory driving globalization.
Yeah, and this one was really all about the potential economic gains. It was rooted in something called Ricardian comparative advantage.
Okay, I've heard of that. It's the idea that countries specialize in what they're good at producing.
Right. Right, exactly. So the U.S., maybe it's good at, designing software or financial services.
Right.
And other countries, maybe they're better at manufacturing, because they have lower wages or whatever. So the theory was, even if we experience some short-term difficulties.
Job losses, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. Job losses in manufacturing because wages are lower in other countries. But eventually, the economy will adjust, right?
That's a big assumption.
It is, it is. So the idea was foreign markets will open up, those other countries, their wages will increase, their currencies will adjust, and eventually we won't see these big, persistent trade imbalances.
Okay, so cheaper goods and a more balanced playing field in the long run.
Yeah, that was the hope. And you did see some of those efficiencies play out, like lots of goods became cheaper, which helped to keep inflation down for a while. But the article emphasizes that a lot of people didn't really think about the downsides, especially how those benefits would be distributed.
Right. Not everyone wins equally in these situations.
Absolutely. And the article argues that it actually contributed to the rise in inequality in the U.S., which has had huge social and political consequences.
Yeah, huge. Okay, so we've got cheaper goods, but also rising inequality. Is that the whole story?
Well, the other big problem, and Bessent really hammers this home, is that this whole self-correction mechanism of Ricardian advantage, it didn't really happen.
It didn't in a lot of key trading relationships.
Yeah, it just didn't work out that way. And he points to a lot of deliberate policy choices that were made by foreign governments. Obviously, China is the biggest example, but he also mentions Japan, South Korea.
Economies that are really export-oriented.
Exactly. And what were these policies? We're talking about things like tariffs, which are taxes on imports.
Right, making foreign goods more expensive.
Exactly. Or non-tariff barriers, which can be really complicated regulations, making it hard for foreign companies to sell their stuff.
Right, so it's not just about open markets, it's about all these other rules and regulations.
Exactly. Then you've got things like currency manipulation.
Right, where they weaken their currency to make their exports cheaper.
Exactly. And then you've got subsidies for key industries.
Giving them an artificial advantage.
Exactly. And then even more aggressive stuff like forcing technology transfers and intellectual property theft.
Wow, that sounds pretty serious. So it's not just a free market competition.
No, it's not a level playing field. And it goes even deeper than those obvious measures. Bessent also talks about how some governments, they actually structure their whole economies in a way that creates these imbalances.
How so?
He points out that a lot of countries intentionally keep the share of national income that goes to households relatively low.
So people are getting a smaller slice of the pie.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that this seems like an internal policy, right?
Yeah.
But it has a huge impact on international trade. Because if you keep domestic consumption low,
People aren't buying as much stuff at home.
right, then they have more to sell abroad. And their exports become even more competitive. He uses China as the most extreme example, but he also talks about Germany and Vietnam.
So, boosting exports by suppressing domestic demand. Interesting.
And the big picture here, according to Bessent, is that these global imbalances, they're actually getting worse. He points to the U.S. trade deficit, which just hit a post-pandemic high. And the annual deficit in goods, it's on track to exceed $1 trillion for the fourth year in a row.
Wow. $1 trillion.
Yeah. And this suggests that just focusing on China isn't enough. It's a systemic problem.
So if we're importing so much more than we're exporting, that creates this huge imbalance.
Exactly. And here's a really important point. What we think of as free trade, it's not always truly free markets.
Yeah.
Especially when a free market economy like the U.S. is trading with economies that are heavily managed by their governments. It's almost like we're importing their industrial policy choices.
So our free market is being influenced by their managed markets. And since it's a global system, these imbalances don't just affect the countries directly involved.
No, it ripples out to everyone. So given all these problems that Bessent points out, what does he propose as a solution? Well, he's very clear that he doesn't want to abandon the whole system. He thinks that would be a huge mistake.
Okay, so no throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But something has to change.
Right, something has to change. And his focus is on addressing the root causes of these global imbalances. And he's really adamant that these need to be global solutions.
Because if it's just the U.S. acting alone.
It just shifts the problem around. Like, if we impose tariffs on goods from China, then maybe companies just move their production to Vietnam,
Right. So you're not actually solving the problem. So
Yeah.
what does he suggest then?
Well, he talks about using macroeconomic tools, things like broad-based tariffs, to try to even things out.
So instead of targeting specific industries, it's more about influencing the overall trade flows. Why does he prefer that?
He argues that it's more effective, that it acts more directly on the trade imbalances. If you make imports generally more expensive, then it encourages domestic production and it shifts consumption patterns.
Okay, so nudging the market in a different direction.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with industrial policy, where the government tries to pick winners and losers.
Right, trying to decide which industries to support.
Exactly. And he thinks that's often inefficient and can create all sorts of unintended consequences.
Governments aren't always great at picking winners, are they?
No, they're not. And he's also really big on the importance of communication. It's not about sudden, unpredictable moves. It's about well-telegraphed changes with clear forward guidance.
So being transparent about the plan.
Exactly. And that does a couple of things. First, it gives you leverage in negotiations with other countries.
If they know what's coming, they might change their behavior.
Exactly. And second, it gives businesses and markets time to adjust, so it reduces the risk of sudden shocks. People can plan for the future.
Right, so it's not about disrupting the system, it's about reforming it.
Exactly. And, Bessent doesn't let the U.S. off the hook either. He says we need to get our own act together, specifically when it comes to our budget deficits.
Yeah, we've got massive deficits. He wants to see spending cuts.
That's his main proposal. He thinks tax revenues are pretty much in line with historical norms.
But spending has ballooned.
Exactly. And he argues that these huge deficits, they actually contribute to the global imbalances. How does that work?
Well, when the U.S. government is spending a ton of money, that creates a lot of demand in the economy.
Right.
And if that demand isn't met by domestic production, guess what? We start importing more stuff.
And that widens the trade deficit.
Exactly.
So getting our own fiscal house in order is a key part of his plan. But here's where things get really interesting. He proposes something pretty radical. He wants to see a much tighter link between security and economic relationships.
Okay, that's interesting. So not just treating them as separate issues.
Exactly. He argues that trade with countries that are also our security allies, that's the kind of trade that's most beneficial and least likely to create vulnerabilities.
It makes sense. You're more likely to trust your allies.
Right. And he suggests that we should link things like security guarantees, our commitment to defend our allies, and access to U.S. markets.
The carrot and the stick.
Exactly. And we link those things to concrete commitments from those allies. Like they need to increase their own spending on defense.
Contribute more to the common defense.
Right. And they need to, change their economic policies to help reduce these global imbalances.
So it's a quid pro quo.
Right.
We provide security and market access. They help balance the economic scales.
Yeah.
And share the defense burden.
Exactly. And he even talks about creating a dynamic system, where countries can move closer or further away from this core group based on their actions.
So it's not a fixed system, it's more fluid.
Exactly. Countries that contribute more, they get more benefits. Countries that don't, well, they might find themselves on the outside looking in.
It's like a system of incentives and consequences.
Exactly. And he argues that this would be much more effective than just focusing on bilateral relationships, one country at a time.
It's a more strategic approach.
Yeah.
And what about the countries that don't want to play ball?
Well, he thinks the cost of being excluded from this U.S.-led zone would be pretty high, especially when you consider things like Chinese overcapacity. If China can't sell as much to the U.S., then all that excess production, it's going to flood into other countries.
And potentially destabilize their economies.
Exactly. And then there's this bigger geopolitical point that he makes. He argues that any other country that might try to become a global hegemon,
like a dominant power.
right, they're unlikely to be as benevolent as the U.S.
So there's a value judgment there. The U.S., with all its flaws, is still the best option for global leadership.
That's his argument. So to kind of sum up, what Bessent is saying is the global economic system is out of whack. He calls it an unsustainable disequilibrium.
Catchy phrase.
Yeah. And he thinks this is a big part of why people, especially in the West, are so disillusioned with globalization.
It's not delivering for everyone.
Exactly. And his final point, the thing he really wants us to think about, is this. If we want to preserve the good parts of globalization, the parts that actually benefit everyone, then we need to rethink some of the fundamental assumptions that we've been operating under for decades.
So questioning the dogma.
Exactly. And we need to update those assumptions to reflect the realities of today's world. A world where you've got these big managed economies and where economics and security are totally intertwined.
Complex stuff.
It is. So just to quickly recap, Bessent's main argument in The Economist is that while we shouldn't abandon global trade, we do need to fix the system.
Yeah.
He says the old theories didn't pan out the way people thought. There are these huge global imbalances that are being driven by the policies of certain countries, and we need to start thinking about security and economics together. His solution is to adjust the root causes of these imbalances globally. He wants to use broad economic tools, and he wants to create a kind of new economic order centered around our allies. And again, it's important to remember that this is just one guy's perspective. These are the ideas of Scott Bessent writing in The Economist.
And they don't necessarily represent the views of the magazine itself.
Exactly. But it's definitely food for thought.
It is. And it raises a really important question for everyone listening. Given this complicated relationship between economics and national security, how do you think the global trading system should evolve? How do we balance these competing interests?
Right. How do we make it work for everyone? It's a big question, but it's one that we all need to be thinking about, because the answers are going to shape the future of the world. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into economic news.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.